Welcome back. In this lesson, we'll be focusing on the JavaScript for loop. So to get started, if you go ahead and go into your project folder, go into the 25-for loop folder, and the start subfolder, if you can go ahead and open up main.js, then in your browser, if you can go ahead and open up the index.html file, you should see for loop on the page. So basically, a loop in JavaScript is something that's going to execute multiple times until we reach some type of criteria that causes us to break out of that loop. And we can use loops for executing certain lines of code multiple times without having to rewrite that code over and over and over again to execute that code. One of the common use cases of using a for loop is when you want to iterate over an array. So before, we used the for each method on the array to iterate over our array until we processed each value. So in addition to the for each method, you can also use a for loop to loop over all the elements in an array. So to see an example of this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create an array. So I'm going to do const my array, and I'm going to set it equal to 1, 2, and 3. So let's say we have a use case where we want to write out all of these elements to our web page here. And as we know, one way to do this is we could use the for each method to iterate over our array. Another option is we could use a for loop to execute a line of code for the number of items in our array. To see an example of this, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and console log each of our items in our array using a for loop. So to create a for loop, the first thing we need to do is we need to use the for keyword in JavaScript. Next, we need to do an open and closing parenthesis, followed by an open and closing curly bracket. So in our for loop, we need to specify 3 statements. And these 3 statements put together will dictate how many times our code block inside our for statement is going to run. So our first statement will be executed 1 time before the execution of our code block. So generally, what you'll see is some type of variable set to a value. Generally, you could see a variable called I, and we'll go ahead and set it equal to 0. So when our for loop runs, this line of code is going to execute 1 time. So we're going to have a variable called I, and it's going to be set to the value of 0. Our second line of code will be our condition that'll dictate how many times our for statement is going to go ahead and execute our line of code. So generally, this will be some type of comparison. So generally, this is some type of comparison. So in our example, what we're going to do is we're going to do I is less than my array.length. So what we're doing here is we're saying if I is less than our my array length, so we see we have a length of 3. Then we're going to go ahead and execute this code. So right now, because I will always stay 0, our statement is going to run infinitely. It's just going to keep executing over and over and over again. And so this is where our third statement comes into play. So after our code in our for block has ran, then this line of code is going to execute. So what we can do is we can increment our I variable to increase by 1. So then that way, after this executes 1 time, I is equal to 1. 1 will be less than 3. Execute again, so then it'll be 2. And then finally we get to 3, and because it's not, then we break out of our for loop and we stop running our code. So then what we're going to go ahead and do in our for block is we'll go ahead and do a console log. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do I, and I'm going to do comma, and I'm going to go ahead and log I's value. And then what we'll do is we'll copy our console log, but then I'm going to change this to my array, followed by our brackets so we can select an index, and then I'm going to use I for our index. So then we're going to save and refresh. And what we'll see here is we'll see 2 lines of code for every element that's inside our array. First, we're going to see I. So I is our own variable right here, and we're incrementing it every time this line of code runs. So you'll see we start at 0, we go to 1, then we go to 2. And then in addition to that, we're just logging the value of my array for that index. So index 0 is 1, index 1 is 2, index 2 is 3. So it's important to note that these 3 statements can be anything that you want them to be. So for example, instead of just incrementing I by 1, I could go ahead and set I equal to I plus 2. So now if we save and refresh, we should see a different type of loop because we start at 0, we run time, and then we add 2 to it, so now we are at 2. We execute the second time, and because now we're at 4, we're greater than our 3, so it never runs a third time. So I'm just going to go ahead and revert this back. So some things to note about our statements here. So for the first statement, we can initiate many values in statement 1 as long as they're separated by commas. So generally we see 1, but if you do need multiple values, you can do that here in the first statement. In our second statement, this line is completely optional. However, as we mentioned, if we don't have some type of criteria, this will be an infinite loop, and it will just keep running until our browser crashes. If we do omit this, then you need to make sure we include a break statement, so that way we can go ahead and exit out of our loop. And then finally, your third statement here, this one can also be omitted as we discussed. However, we'll want some way to increment the statement here. So we could have our counter inside our for statement here. So at the end of all of our lines, we could do our I++, and this will update our variable value. So the next loop I want to take a look at is the for in loop. The for in loop is special because it can be used to loop through the properties of an object. So one use case is, let's say we want to go ahead and log out all of the properties of our object individually, but we don't want to go through and do a console log for object.propertyName for every property. What we could do is we could use the for in loop to loop through all these properties and then just do one statement that says console log, property value, and property name. So to see an example, I'm just going to do const, I'm going to do object, and we'll go ahead and set it equal to an object, and I'm just going to go ahead and do test1, I'm going to set it to 1, test2, I'm going to set that to 2, I'm going to do test3, and I'm just going to go ahead and set this to an array. And then to loop through our properties, what we can do is we can do for, so we use the for keyword, and then we do our parentheses, followed by opening and closing curlies. So what's unique about the for in is we need to specify the keyword in our first statement here. So there's only one statement that's inside our parentheses here. And how this works is we specify our variable. So we could do let prop in our object. And then what we'll do is we'll just do console log prop. We'll also do our object with our brackets, and then we'll pass prop in as our property name. All right, so what's happening here is in our for loop, we know this is a for in loop because we start with for, and then in our statement we include the keyword in, and then in our statement we have some type of variable inside our object. So then this will tell JavaScript that this is a for in loop, and we're going to loop over all of the properties in our object, and those properties will be referenced in a variable called prop. And then that way we can use that property name to log the property name or access the property by its name. So go ahead and save and refresh. You'll see that for our prop, we get our property name, so we have test 1, 2, and 3. And then because we know our property name, we can access that value on our object by using the index here. So then we get 1, 2, and our array. And then finally, we have our for of loop. So the for of loop is used when you want to loop over values of an iterable object. Two examples of iterable objects we've worked with in the past are arrays and strings. We can use the for of loop to loop through all of the values in our array, and we could use the for of loop to loop through all of the characters in our string. So the for of loop is similar to our for in loop. So what we'll do is we'll have our keyword for, we'll have our parentheses, and then our statement is the variable of our iterable. So basically our let x of our iterable object. So what we'll do is we'll reuse my array, and then we have our opening and closing brackets. So then what we can do is we can do console log x, and x should be referring to that particular element. So if we go ahead and save and refresh, we should see all of the elements of our array get logged to their console, and we do. So we have 1, 2, and 3. As I mentioned, we can also do this on strings. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and copy this statement here, and we'll go ahead and change this to hi there as a string, and we'll go ahead and save and refresh. And now you'll see, because this is a string object, we're going to iterate through each character on our string, so we get each character individually.